Hello class. I'm coming to you today from my office because I work in the office on Wednesday, and I wanted to take a few minutes to walk you through some slides on causal reasoning, our topic for this week. Let's get into it. Okay, as I mentioned, the topic this week is causal reasoning, and we're going to take a look at a presentation on that. I'm going to pull this up now. And a causal argument is just an inductive argument whose conclusion contains a causal claim. So that definition tells us a lot. It tells us we're dealing with inductive arguments. So an inductive argument, you will recall, is an argument whose conclusion, at best, follows only probably. So if we encounter an inductive argument, we would never say back, well, not necessarily, because we know not necessarily. It's an inductive argument. At best, their conclusions follow probably. Doesn't mean we don't believe it. We can believe to a certain probabilistic degree. If it's a good inductive argument, we might believe and say, that's a strong argument. I agree with the conclusion. It is well supported. But we would also know there's a chance that new information could come in that would cause us to withdraw our support for that argument. So, for example, smoking causes cancer because there's a strong correlation between long-term smoking and certain types of cancer. That's a good inductive argument. We would then go to look for the data or evidence that supports the premise, that supports the strong correlation between long-term smoking and certain types of cancer. Once we found that evidence, we would conclude that this inductive argument is not only strong, which is to say its conclusion does follow probably, we would also say it's cogent. It has true information in the premises. Those are the two things we look for. I do want to mention that we can support causal claims using argument patterns we've seen. So we've seen enumerative induction, and we've seen analogical induction. Someone could argue using enumerative induction to say, here's a situation where when I did X, Y occurred. Another situation, X happened and Y occurred. Therefore, doing X causes Y. There's a statistical kind of correlation. This is enumerative induction, right? We might look at samples of situations where X leads to Y or X leads to other things and see of that sample how many times X leads to Y. We could also argue analogically. Maybe 20 years ago, high employment caused some phenomenon, maybe inflation. Well, if 20 years ago it did, and the current situation is very similar to 20 years ago, we might think there's going to be high inflation now because of high unemployment. Now, I'm just making up that data. Unemployment is at a low as of the time of the recording of this video, but we can use analogical induction to support causal claims. And we have yet to do inference to the best explanation, but you can also use inference to the best explanation. We're going to cover that in our next chapter, but stay tuned. It can also be used to support a causal claim. We, in this chapter, are going to see 4 patterns for asserting causal connections. That's the pattern of the method of agreement, method of difference. You can put them together to get agreement and difference. That's method 3. And then the final one is concomitant variation, or the method of correlation. I'm just going to walk through some schematics right now and tell you a little bit about the different methods so that it can help you with the reading and the homework. This is the method of agreement. And the principle is pretty basic. If 2 or more occurrences of a phenomenon have exactly one relevant factor in common, that factor probably is the cause. So, for example, the first dot might say one occurrence of a phenomenon, E. And the factors that were there that led to E were factors A, B, and C. Another occurrence of that phenomenon might have been preceded by factors A, C, and D. And maybe yet a third occurrence of that phenomenon had factors B and C present, and yet a fourth occurrence of that phenomenon had factors C and D. Well, is there any one factor that's common to all 4 occurrences of that phenomenon? Yes, factor C. C is in the occurrence 1, 2, 3, and 4. Since it's the only thing they have in common, it's probably factor C that caused the phenomenon E. We know it's not A because if it were A, then if you take away A, you would lose the effect. Causes work in that way. If the cause is there, you get the effect, and if you remove the cause, you lose the effect. If you take away a cause and still get the effect, you know that's not the cause of that effect. So that's the basis for the method of agreement. You look at many different occurrences of a phenomenon and see what they have in common. You can also look for where occurrences differ. So here, the relevant factor present when a phenomenon occurs and absent when the phenomenon does not occur must be the cause. Now, this argument can get tricky. Sometimes we might look at something and think it's the method of difference when it's really the method of agreement. But notice here, it can't be method of agreement because we only have one situation where we get the effect. Factors A, B, and C are followed by the phenomenon E. So there's no other situation for that to agree with. But there is a situation where we might look to see whether it disagrees with it or there's a difference. Notice the second thing says factors A and B are not followed by E. So notice that factor C has been removed and we've lost the effect. Well, if A, B, and C are there when the effect is there, and if you remove C so that you still have A and B and you don't get the effect, well, guess what? It's not A and B because you would still get the effect. So you know it must be C. C is followed by it, and when you remove C, you lose the effect. Well, C is probably the cause of E. So you look for two situations, one situation where you get the effect, another situation where you don't have the effect, and you see how those two situations differ. Where they differ is probably the cause of the effect. Now you can put them together. Consider a real-world case, right? So if you were like me, chances are you may have taken a trip with lots of other students to a big mall. In my high school, we often went to the mall in Birmingham, Alabama, and we would be released to the food court to eat our food. And inevitably the next day, some people might get sick. So suppose there's a case of food poisoning. What would we do? Well, we would separate all the people who got food poisoning into one group, and we would put all the people who did not get food poisoning into another group. And so suppose that in the case of food poisoning, we have a situation where someone got sick, so that is our effect. And of the people that got sick, we notice that some ate at Sbarro, some ate at Subway, and some ate at Taco Bell. And we've got another sick person, and we say, oh, they got something from Sbarro, they got something from Subway. And in this case, instead of Taco Bell, maybe they went to McDonald's, so maybe that's D. And then we've got a fourth person who is not sick, but they did eat at Subway and they did eat at Taco Bell. And maybe we've got a fourth person who did not get sick. They ate at, what was my second one? Subway, and they ate at McDonald's. Well, which factor is there when people got sick and which factor is not there when they didn't get sick? Well, if we just use agreement, we'll only be able to narrow it down to A and B. Because in the cases where someone got sick, they only agree in A and they only agree in B, either A or B. That doesn't tell us which one it is. But we can use the method of difference with the method of agreement to further narrow it down. Notice that in cases where B and C is there, you don't get the effect. So it's probably not B and C. Cross B and C off. We know when B and D is there, you don't get the sickness. So we can cross B and C off our list. So agreement told us it was either A or B. Difference told us it was not B. Therefore, it's what? A. If it's either A or B and it's not B, it's got to be A. A is probably the cause of the sickness. Combining the method of agreement, where situations agree, and difference, looking for differences in cases of having the effect and not having the effect. And lastly, we get the method of concomitant variation. This one's an important one. You see this a lot, especially in scientific studies around health and medicine. So this is when two events are correlated in the right way, they're probably causally related. Maybe you've heard someone say correlation doesn't imply causation. That's not true if it's the right kind of correlation. And that kind of correlation is concomitant variation. What it means is that things that are causally related usually vary together. So think about something like smoking, to go back to our first example. How do we know that smoking causes cancer? Well, if you hold other things constant and vary the intensity of the smoking, you get a co-varying intensity of cancer. So for example, if someone smokes 10 cigarettes a day, maybe there's a certain percentage chance they get cancer. But if they smoke 2 packs a day, that percentage chance they get cancer goes up, and if they decrease smoking, those percentage chances go down. Smoking intensity varies with cancer likelihood. Since those two things co-vary together, they're probably causally correlated. That's the right kind of correlation. So we would say that factor is causally connected with the event that we're trying to determine the cause of. So here again, we've got lots of factors. Suppose we know that A, B, and C are correlated with E, but we haven't narrowed down which one it is yet. We might think that some people are just predisposed to get cancer. Maybe that's factor A. Maybe it's genetics. There's a certain genetic marker that we think might be related to cancer. Suppose B is smoking, and suppose C is eats French fries on the weekends, right? Well, if you want to figure out which one it is, you hold two of those factors constant, and you increase and decrease the other. So you could look for people who eat lots of French fries on the weekend, and then people who eat just fewer French fries on the weekend, but you hold constant smoking and those genetic markers. Do you see a change in the likelihood that someone gets cancer? No. Okay, so it's not French fries. Let's look for those genetic markers and hold the other things constant. So hold smoking constant and hold eats French fries on the weekend constant, and look for those genetic markers to see if genetic markers don't really vary in intensity, but you would not see that change. Now let's hold eating French fries constant, genetic markers constant, and vary the intensity or the amount that someone smokes, and now you do see a corresponding variation in likelihood that someone gets cancer. That tells us likelihood to get cancer is caused by the smoking because those two vary together. That's the method of concomitant variation. If you see any of those patterns, those are good patterns. We would say those arguments are strong. Then step 2 would be to go look at the information in the premises to determine whether it's a good, accurate, reliable information. If it is, we would call those inductive causal arguments cogent. A cogent inductive argument is one that would be convincing. It's got all the information there that we need, it hasn't left anything important out, and that information is reliable. Now, the last thing I'm going to tell you about are necessary and sufficient conditions, because these relate to thinking about causality. A necessary condition is just something that has to be there when an event occurs. In other words, a necessary condition for the occurrence of some event is one without which the event cannot occur. Remember, take away the cause, lose the effect. So for instance, we will do it in the case of thinking about bachelors. So this is not a causal case, it's just meant to illustrate necessary and sufficient conditions. Is it necessary that a bachelor be unmarried? Yes. In other words, if you're not unmarried or you're married, I know you're not a bachelor. So being unmarried is a necessary condition for being a bachelor. But it's not a sufficient condition. What's a sufficient condition? A sufficient condition is one that guarantees that the event occurs. So, does being unmarried guarantee that you're a bachelor? No. If you're unmarried, I don't know enough about you to know whether you're a bachelor or not. So being unmarried is necessary for being a bachelor, but not sufficient. What are all the factors necessary for being a bachelor? Well, you might think you have to be unmarried, you have to be male, you got to be an adult, there are no bachelor children running around, and you've got to somehow be on the market, right? You somehow be, playing the field or something like that, right? In this sense, someone like the Pope is not a bachelor, right? He might be an unmarried adult male, but he's certainly not a bachelor because he's removed himself from the market, so to speak. So you need to be an unmarried adult male who's somehow available in some sense. Each of those conditions is individually necessary. If you're a bachelor, you're unmarried. If you're a bachelor, you're male. If you're a bachelor, you're an adult. If you're a bachelor, you're somehow available or on the market. But then if you put together all those necessary conditions, you do get a sufficient condition. If you're an unmarried adult male who's somehow on the market, then you're a bachelor. So sometimes a whole bunch of necessary conditions together can make a sufficient condition. We see this when we talk about cause and effect. Sometimes we might think we have the cause of some effect, when in reality we've located a necessary condition. It has to be there when the effect occurs, such that if you lost that necessary condition, you would lose the effect, but it may not be the cause. There may be other conditions that, together with those necessary conditions, would make a sufficient condition for bringing about the effect. It can sound a little confusing, but this is one that just takes a little bit of practice. What I would do is write down a whole bunch of if-thens in lots of different orders. When you have an if-then, I will back up one screen here. Here we go. This is what I want. So if you write down a whole bunch of if-thens, you can write if A, then B. In an if-then, the first part of an if-then is your sufficient condition. The second part of an if-then is a necessary condition. If you think you have a necessary condition, then you put it in the second blank of an if-then and see if it turns out true. So if you think being unmarried is necessary for being a bachelor, put being a bachelor in the first blank of an if-then, if so-and-so is a bachelor, then, and then put being unmarried in the second blank. If somebody's a bachelor, then they're unmarried. Is that true? Yes. Being a bachelor is sufficient for being unmarried, and being unmarried is necessary, it goes backwards, for being a bachelor. So write down if-thens, and then mix up the orders. What you're seeing on the screen and what you can download in the presentation in Blackboard is this short list. All of these expressions are synonymous, but you have to notice that the order changes. If someone were to write X occurs only if Y occurs, that's the same thing as saying if X occurs, then Y occurs. But notice the first one uses the expression only if. The second one uses just the expression if. Whatever follows just an if is alleged to be a sufficient condition for the other thing. Whatever follows an only if is alleged to be the necessary condition. Remember, necessary conditions go second in an if-then. Sufficient conditions go first. But you could also flip the order even further and say Y occurs if X occurs. How do you know that says the same thing as the one immediately above it? Well, the second one says Y occurs if X occurs, and the first one says if X occurs, then Y occurs. The X is still next to the if. I don't want to keep belaboring this point. This is one that just takes a little bit of practice. Write down some expressions, change the order, and try out some on your own, and see if you can find some necessary conditions for something else, and see if you can find some sufficient conditions for something else. We might ask, is baiting your hook either necessary or sufficient for catching a fish? Well, let's see if it's sufficient for catching a fish. If you bait your hook, will you catch a fish? No, right? Baiting your hook is not a guarantee that you will catch a fish. Otherwise, it would be very easy. So we would say, since that if-then is false, we would say baiting your hook is not sufficient for catching a fish. But let's see if it's necessary. If you've caught a fish, did you bait your hook? Probably. I mean, fish don't just bite unbaited hooks for no good reason, right? They're going after the thing they think is food. So we would probably say that baiting your hook is necessary for catching a fish. You've got to do it. It's part of good fish catching. So it's necessary, but not sufficient. Take a little time to practice those. I hope this helped you out a little bit with causal arguments. Let's remember there are 4 kinds of causal arguments. So we're going to review those real quick. Method of agreement, method of difference, then you can put agreement and difference together to make the method of agreement and difference. And then the fourth was the method of concomitant variation. Each of those is a causal argument whose conclusion is a causal claim. If you see those patterns and they're done well, you can conclude that the conclusion follows probably. You've probably found the cause of the phenomenon you're trying to find the cause of. More evidence could make those arguments stronger. More bad evidence could make those arguments weaker. That is a risk with inductive arguments. New evidence can change our evaluation of them. But until that new evidence comes in, so long as we haven't left out anything obvious, these are good patterns. And when you see them, you can say, that is probably the cause of the phenomenon. Thank you for taking some time with me. I hope it was okay that I did this in my office today. I know the sound may be a little different, but if you have any questions, let's take them to the forums, or you can shoot me an email. Thanks.